Matthew Ellison was admired, envied, and followed by millions, but behind the luxury, fame, and fatherly charm was a chilling secret. He murdered his own daughter, Chloe, on a dream vacation that turned into a calculated nightmare. Matthew Ellison was the kind of man people envied. His face was familiar to millions, gracing the covers of financial magazines and social media feeds. Known as a visionary entrepreneur, he had built a chain of luxury resorts from scratch. His Instagram showed a pristine villa perched above the Aegean Sea, chef preparing Mediterranean dishes, and Chloe chasing butterflies in the garden. After a brief search by resort staff and emergency responders, Chloe's body was discovered at the base of a rocky cliff not far from the villa. Commenters posted old pictures of Matthew and Chloe, calling them the ideal father-daughter pair. Questions began to form quietly, out of view of the media spotlight. People close to the case whispered about odd behavior, gaps in time, and one too many coincidences. While the public mourned a tragic accident, a darker truth was beginning to emerge behind the scenes. Chloe had suffered not just trauma from the fall, but additional injuries that couldn't be explained by a simple accident. Witnesses described him as evasive and strangely composed. He refused to hand over his personal phone for analysis, claiming it had been lost during the chaos of the rescue. When police retrieved backup data from his cloud storage, they discovered a deleted series of messages sent to an unknown number the night before Chloe's death. The texts were encrypted, but metadata revealed they were sent at a time Matthew claimed to be asleep. Bruising around her ribs and shoulders, a fractured wrist, and evidence of blunt force trauma to her head all suggested something far more violent had occurred. The coroner noted that some of the injuries likely occurred before the fall, pointing to a struggle rather than a misstep. Chloe had also ingested a high level of antihistamines, enough to cause drowsiness or unconsciousness in a child her size. Investigators now believe the fall had been staged to cover something much darker, the kind of truth no one could imagine from a man who had it all: a successful empire, a loving daughter, and a life most people could only dream of. But sometimes, dreams are the perfect place to hide nightmares. She was his whole world, some wrote. He must be destroyed. On paper, everything seemed to point to a terrible accident. But the deeper they looked, the more the inconsistencies surfaced. One of the first red flags came from the timeline. Villa staff told authorities they hadn't seen Chloe at breakfast the morning she was reported missing. In fact, several of them hadn't seen her since the afternoon of the previous day. That left an unexplained 18-hour gap before Matthew made the frantic phone call to report her disappearance. Surveillance footage from a neighboring property further complicated the picture. Chloe hadn't been seen walking toward the cliffs at all. But Matthew had just after sunrise alone and carrying what appeared to be a large, heavy duffel bag. For a brief moment, the world rallied around him in sympathy. Forensics teams found no child-sized footprints near the edge of the cliff, where she was believed to have fallen. Strangely, there were drag marks in the loose soil, half covered by kicked-up gravel, almost as if something or someone had been moved to the edge and then pushed. These findings contradicted Matthew's version of events, stated he had left Chloe asleep while he took a business call in the next room. That call, when traced, had actually been made hours later than he claimed. She was still wearing her sandals and a sundress, but she was unresponsive. The fall appeared fatal. Greek police conducted an initial examination and considered it a tragic accident. The cliffside had no guardrails, and it wasn't unusual for tourists to lose their footing on the uneven path. Matthew was reportedly in the villa on a business call at the time. He sounded devastated. His face, pale and trembling, was caught on camera as paramedics arrived. It seemed like the perfect break from Matthew's packed schedule. To the outside world, the trip was just another chapter in their storybook life. But just 4 days after their arrival, everything changed. His story was a perfect mix of ambition, charm, and calculated decisions. But what made him even more appealing to the public was his role as a devoted single father. After the unexpected death of his wife in a car crash 5 years earlier, Matthew stepped into the role of sole parent to his daughter Chloe. The world admired him for it. In every photo, Chloe was right there beside him, smiling, holding his hand, dressed in designer clothes. She was part of his brand, whether he realized it or not. Together, they appeared at charity galas, resort openings, and even in a series of promotional videos for his newest beachfront property. When the news broke that Matthew and Chloe were vacationing in Mykonos for the summer, fans followed the updates with excitement. On a warm July morning, local authorities received a call from Matthew. He said he couldn't find his daughter. News outlets across the world picked up the story, tributes poured in. But not everyone was convinced. The local coroner noticed that Chloe's injuries were inconsistent with a clean fall. As the initial shock of Chloe's death settled, Greek investigators began to scrutinize the details more closely. Police returned to the villa to re-examine the scene. As the autopsy results came in, the case shifted entirely. Matthew was called back in for more questioning. While he remained calm and sorrowful in public, his behavior in private raised suspicions. Witnesses described him as evasive and strangely composed. He refused to hand over his personal phone for analysis, claiming it had been lost during the chaos of the rescue. When police retrieved backup data from his cloud storage, they discovered a deleted series of messages sent to an unknown number the night before Chloe's death. Chloe's school had contacted Child Protective Services just months earlier about her repeated absences and emotional withdrawal. His lifestyle, once seen as aspirational, now appeared fragile and carefully manufactured. 6 months before Chloe's death, Matthew had taken out a life insurance policy in her name worth $12 million. His main investors were demanding results, and he had no new projects or capital. Though the messages had been wiped from Matthew's phone, forensic recovery tools pulled the metadata. A few messages stood out. One sent 2 days before Chloe's death simply read, "Remote location confirmed. No cameras on east side." Another said, "Must look like an accident. Quick, no struggle." Authorities couldn't prove he hired someone, but the language suggested detailed planning and possible outside help. Within days, Greek authorities confirmed he had sailed to Montenegro using a private charter under a false name. For 3 weeks, he moved through the Balkans undetected, switching vehicles, identities, and keeping his communications strictly offline. He knew how to disappear. He had the money, the resources, and the motive. But he couldn't hide forever. It was evident that he had started seeing Chloe not as a daughter, but as a financial solution. When officers arrived, they found Matthew alone, calm, and almost expectant. He didn't resist. The quiet surrender only fueled the media storm that exploded once the news broke. Cameras followed every moment of his extradition back to Greece. Reporters shouted questions, but Matthew remained silent. The man once admired as a luxury tycoon and doting father was now the center of one of Europe's most chilling murder trials. In the weeks before the Mykonos trip, search history showed repeated visits to pages about insurance fraud, high-value child policies, and death investigations in foreign jurisdictions. It was an unusually high amount for a child, and the timing of the policy raised eyebrows. They didn't want to risk alerting him and giving him the chance to disappear. But despite their careful planning, Matthew had already vanished. When police arrived at the Mykonos villa to bring him in, they found it empty. The belongings were gone. The yacht docked nearby was missing. The staff claimed he had left early that morning for a day trip. The truth was far more sinister. Matthew had escaped. Investigators traced the paperwork back to a private insurance broker in London. They described a man who was charming in public but cold and calculating in private. One recalled Matthew firing a maid simply for letting Chloe play in the resort garden unsupervised. Another mentioned hearing Chloe crying alone in a locked room during a hotel opening. These weren't just isolated incidents. They formed a consistent pattern of neglect, emotional control, and manipulation.
Right.
Records showed Matthew visited the office multiple times under different aliases, asking detailed questions about payouts in the event of accidental death abroad. The perfect father routine had been nothing more than a shield to hide the truth. Every smiling photo, every tender post, had served a purpose. And now, all of it was being pulled apart, piece by piece, revealing the terrifying possibility that Chloe's death had not only been premeditated, but coldly executed to save a crumbling empire. The broker had flagged the inquiries as odd, but ultimately approved the policy due to Matthew's status and wealth. For years, Matthew had lived beyond his means. Despite owning multiple resorts, financial records showed most were operating at a loss or propped up by higher-risk loans. A pattern of borrowing from obscure offshore accounts began to surface. The lavish lifestyle, the frequent vacations, the charitable appearances with Chloe, They were all part of a facade to keep investors confident and the money flowing. Former nannies told investigators about sudden firings, abrupt schedule changes, and a household ruled by strict silence. No one had connected the dots at the time, but in retrospect, the pattern was clear. Something had been wrong for a long time. What had once been a case of accidental death was now the focus of an international homicide investigation. The texts were encrypted, but metadata revealed they were sent at a time Matthew claimed to be asleep. The pressure increased when reports from back home added new layers to the mystery. As the investigation intensified, a darker portrait of Matthew Ellison emerged, one that sharply contrasted the public image of a devoted father and successful businessman. The most alarming discovery came from a single document buried among hundreds of files. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer the motive became. Matthew's resorts were under threat of collapse. Another twist emerged when police uncovered messages sent through an encrypted messaging app. At the same time, former employees from his resorts began coming forward anonymously. What had once appeared as a high-profile tragedy was now unraveling into a carefully planned crime driven by desperation and greed. The arrest warrant for Matthew Ellison was issued quietly. Without media attention, as Greek authorities coordinated with Interpol, a Europe-wide manhunt began. His private jet was still parked at the island's airstrip, confirming he hadn't flown commercially or used his usual modes of travel. He was finally captured in a remote coastal village, living in a rented villa under an assumed identity. When officers arrived, they found Matthew alone, calm and almost expectant. He didn't resist. The quiet surrender only fueled the media storm that exploded once the news broke. Cameras followed every moment of his extradition back to Greece. But the jury didn't see a broken man, they saw someone methodical, emotionless, and controlled. Witnesses from his inner circle confirmed his manipulative tendencies and frequent deception. Around the world, people who had once admired him were forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Authorities revealed that Matthew's financial empire was even more unstable than previously thought. Many of his businesses had been operating under fraudulent contracts. Some held on to the image he'd sold for years, struggling to accept that a man so charismatic and admired could harbor such darkness. The once celebrated businessman now lived in silence and solitude, his name forever tied not to his success, but to his betrayal. Chloe's memory lived on not through fame or fortune, but through the global efforts to ensure that no other child would suffer in the shadows of ambition. But the evidence was undeniable. The smiling photos, the luxury backdrops, the loving captions, none of it had been real. The story became a grim warning about how easily image can be manipulated, how wealth can mask danger, and how even the most polished surface can hide something rotten underneath. Several investors filed lawsuits, claiming they had been misled or defrauded. The luxury resorts once seen as symbols of success were seized, investigated for money laundering, and eventually sold off. What had appeared to be an empire was now reduced to dust, its foundation built on lies and manipulation. Forensic accountants traced hidden bank accounts, revealing Matthew had moved millions through shell companies in the months leading up to the murder, likely preparing for his eventual disappearance. The carefully curated social media posts, the polished interviews, the glossy magazine covers, all of it had been part of a calculated image. They described a bright, curious little girl who loved painting, animals, and baking cookies. They remembered trying to stay in touch, only to be cut off repeatedly. One aunt told reporters that she'd offered to help care for Chloe after her mother's death, but Matthew refused. He didn't want anyone else involved in raising her, whether out of control, image, or secrecy. The family launched a foundation in Chloe's name, dedicated to protecting children from being exploited by guardians in the public eye. The initiative pushed for legal reforms around life insurance policies for minors and more oversight on how children are used in influencer branding. Behind the lavish lifestyle and doting father act was a man capable of murdering his own daughter to save his reputation and wealth. The story dominated headlines for weeks, with television specials, online forums, and podcasts dissecting every chilling detail. But while the world focused on the drama of the trial, a quieter tragedy remained: the loss of a child whose life had been turned into a marketing tool, then cut short for profit. A former executive assistant testified that Matthew had once joked about people being assets or liabilities. The implication was chilling. Porters shouted questions, but Matthew remained silent. The man once admired as a luxury tycoon and doting father was now the center of one of Europe's most chilling murder trials. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. Prosecutors presented a meticulous case, supported by forensic evidence, financial records, and damning digital trails. They walked the jury through the timeline how Matthew had taken out a suspicious life insurance policy, how Chloe had last been seen alive almost a full day before she was reported missing, and how her injuries told a story far different from a simple fall. Experts testified that the bruises, the overdose of sedatives, and the lack of defensive wounds indicated a staged death scene. They showed recovered messages about no mess and no cameras, painting. Matthew is a man who had not only planned his daughter's murder, but tried to execute it flawlessly. The defense tried to argue mental instability. It claimed Matthew had suffered a breakdown, that the pressures of business and single parenthood pushed him into a dark place. After weeks of testimony and cross-examinations, the verdict was unanimous. Matthew Ellison was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who once lived in mansions and traveled the world in style would now spend the rest of his days behind cold steel bars. The conviction of Matthew Ellison sent shockwaves far beyond the Greek courtroom. In the weeks following the sentencing, a number of disturbing details continued to surface. Chloe's extended family, long estranged from Matthew after years of limited contact, stepped forward to speak about her life. Public reaction was divided. While many mourned Chloe and supported the foundation, others couldn't believe Matthew had been capable of such a calculated act. In prison, Matthew reportedly remained isolated, rarely speaking to others. His lawyers filed appeals, but none gained traction. The once celebrated businessman now lived in silence and solitude. His name forever tied not to his success, but to his betrayal. Chloe's memory lived on not through fame or fortune, but through the global efforts to ensure that no other child would suffer in the shadows of ambition.